Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the gospel of Jesus Christ, the testimony of the biblical prophets, current events, and how these things relate to you and me. Now, in the past few episodes, we have been exploring the text of Ezekiel 38:39, the oracle of Gog of Magog, and specifically, we have been working through its potential relationship to Russian troops on the ground in Syria. This is a huge issue right now that is shaking everything up. This is sort of the next major step in the unfolding of what's going on in the Middle East as we're moving toward the fulfillment of some of the major prophecies in the scriptures concerning the last days. So what does this all mean? And essentially, we've worked through some of the introductory points in terms of understanding Ezekiel 38:39. Last week, we took some time to work through what do the names mean in Ezekiel 38:39. Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, Persia, Kut, and Push. Cush and Put. What do they mean, and how are we to understand them in modern times? And the bottom line is, while so many people believe that this prophecy is pointing to a Russian-led coalition, a careful analysis of those names shows that that is not the case. That in fact it's actually pointing to a Turkish-led coalition. And so when we just begin with that point, it does not appear as though Russian troops on the ground in Syria is the beginning of the fulfillment of Ezekiel 38:39. And what I've said is that instead, in more likelihood, it's pointing to the beginning of the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 8. Now, again, before we get to Daniel chapter 8, I want to take some more time to look at the fact that Gog and the Antichrist must be one and the same individual. Now, again, this is not a popular view. I mean, it's not popular among many of the popular prophecy books. This has not been taught by many of the popular prophecy teachers. And when I say popular, I mean sort of, they've written a lot of books and they're well known. I don't mean popular like, the popular kid at school. I mean, as opposed to the scholarly, more careful commentaries and this sort of thing. When you really look at many of the commentaries and the teachers, many of them just say straight out clearly Gog is the Antichrist. But among those that are more common, that are writing to the people, that are not writing the more scholarly, careful analysis, many of them have just said it's talking about Russia and it's the Antichrist. So I just want to now take some time in this episode to look at some of the key events that unfold as a direct result of the destruction of Gog and his hordes. And this is key because if we want to settle this matter of whether or not Gog is the Antichrist or if he's someone else, we have to look at the events that happen because it lays it out clearly. At the conclusion of Ezekiel 39, at the conclusion of this oracle, it lays out the things that will take place specifically as a result of the destruction of Gog and his hordes. And what we'll see is that these things can only be events that take place at the return of Jesus. And many people say that Ezekiel 38:39, that Gog and Magog, they're destroyed, defeated, either just before or just after the beginning of the final 7 years. That scenario cannot be reconciled with the text. So let's go ahead, let's turn to, if you have a Bible, go ahead and open it up, and let's turn to some of the final verses in chapter 39. Now, I'm reading right now from the NIV. I'm usually an NASB guy, but long story short, I they were selling these genuine bound leather Bibles at the Christian bookstore for $8. Genuine leather for $8. And I said, I'm not super fond of the NIV, but I'm just going to sort of switch Bibles for this round. And, it's always good to sort of switch it up, and sometimes you see things a little bit differently. So all that to qualify. I know many of you out there just hate the NIV, but let's begin at the conclusion in some of the latter verses of Ezekiel 39. I just want to read these, beginning with verse 17. Now again, this gives us clarity into what happens as a direct result of the destruction of Gog and his hordes. So it says, beginning in verse 17, Son of man, the Lord is speaking to Ezekiel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Call out to every kind of bird, and all the wild animals. Assemble, come together from all around to the sacrifice I am preparing for you, the sacrifice on the mountains of Israel. There you will eat flesh and drink blood. You will eat the flesh of mighty men and drink the blood of princes and of the earth, as if they were rams and lambs, goats and bulls, all of them fattened animals from Bashan. At the sacrifice I am preparing for you, you will eat fat, you are glutted, and drink blood till you are drunk. At my table you will eat your fill of horses, of riders, of mighty men, soldiers, of every kind, declares the sovereign Lord. Here's the point. This feast that the Lord says, come, this is the exact same feast that is spoken of in Revelation 19, when you have the cry that goes out to the birds of the air, to the beasts of the field, to come and feast on the flesh of kings and princes and mighty men and horses and warriors and all of these things. There's only one feast that's like this in the Scriptures, and it's right here at the conclusion of the destruction of Gog and his hordes, and then later it's quoted in Revelation 19, which is the quintessential passage that everyone points to that's speaking of the return of Jesus. And so John the Revelator, in John, the revelation of Jesus, of the Apostle John, he quotes directly from Ezekiel 38:39, and he applies this text to the destruction of Antichrist. Now, if Gog and the Antichrist were two different individuals, one, then you have to say there are two feasts that are identical. We're literally almost quoting verbatim from Ezekiel 39. You would have to say that God is basically the author of confusion. Why would he quote from a passage that speaks of the conclusion of a battle and apply it to a battle that describes the Antichrist if the two were not the same? That would be awfully confusing. This is an important point. So now beginning with verse 21, what happens as a result of the destruction of Gog and his armies? Now let's just walk through this. There's quite a few here, but I just want to read through the text. The Lord says this, I will display my glory among the nations, and all the nations, all the Gentiles will see the punishment I inflict and the hand I lay on them. Now get this. So the Gentiles will see that the Lord is going to punish them. He's going to see the punishment that the God of Israel lays on the Gentiles. Now get this in verse 22, because this is critical. From that day forward, the people of Israel will know that I am the Lord their God. This is not mild language. From that day forward. Now, for those who say this happens at the beginning of the 7 years, before or just after the beginning of the final 7 years before the return of Jesus, they run into a huge problem. You can't, because the language here is of them coming to know God. Now, 1 John 2:22 says, if you don't have the Son, you don't have the Father. Okay, so there's no knowledge, there's no true knowledge of God apart from Yeshua, apart from Jesus, the Son of Yehovah, the Son of God. God sent forth His very essence into the world. That is the ultimate revelation of who He is. And apart from that revelation, you don't know God. And yet it says, all Israel will know that I am the Lord their God from that time forward. This is not just simply, I've seen prophecy teachers say this. They go, well, from there forward, all of the Jews will know that Jehovah's their God. They don't actually get saved. They don't actually become followers of Yeshua, but they at least know that Jehovah's their God. Well, that's just a lame explanation, and it falls flat in terms of explaining what's said here. From that day forward, all of Israel comes to know God, and we'll see that that's validated later on So they come to know the Lord their God. This is only something that can be applied to the time when Jesus returns. What does it say in Zechariah 12? It says, they will look upon the one they have pierced, and they will weep and mourn and lament when they see the one they've pierced coming on the clouds of heaven, right? And then the spirit of grace and supplication will be poured out onto them. They repent, they weep, they mourn, as one mourns for an only son. And so this is the time when the remnant of Israel comes to know the Lord. It's when Jesus returns. From that day forward, they will know that I am the Lord their God. What else does it say? The nations will know that the people of Israel went into exile for their sin because they were unfaithful to me. The nations will know that the difficulties that will come on Israel in the last days come because of their unfaithfulness. And then it says, the Lord says, so I hid my face from them, I handed them over to their enemies, and they all fell by the sword. This is yet to come. It's not all of Israel, but the remnant will be left. But there is a time of Jacob's trouble that is yet coming to the nation of Israel. I dealt with them according to their uncleanness, their offenses. I hid my face from them. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Now, we move into the next critical point. I will now restore the fortunes of Jacob. Some translations say, I will bring back all the captives of Jacob, all the captives of Israel. He's talking about bringing back those that were taken as prisoners of war during the battle that just previously took place, during the war that just previously took place of Gog of Magog. I will restore the fortunes of Jacob. I will have compassion on all the people of Israel, and I will be zealous for my holy name. They will forget their shame and all the unfaithfulness that they showed toward me when they lived in safety in the land with none to make them afraid. Now that description of Israel dwelling safely in the land with none to make them afraid, that's language from the beginning of the prophecy, at the beginning of chapter 38, which says that Gog looks out and he sees them living in safety with none to make them afraid, and he says, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. So the prophecy begins with Israel in the land, feeling secure, feeling safe, and at the end they are being brought back as captives, reminded of their unfaithfulness when they lived in their land, secure with none to make them afraid. So no one can say that this invasion of Ezekiel is a failure. It's clearly a success because Israel begins in the land, and at the end of the text, they're being brought back to the land. That means there was a tremendous victory on behalf of Gog, of the Antichrist. Now we're getting into the more critical elements of the text. When I have brought them back from the nations, have gathered them from the countries of their enemies. The enemies are the armies of the Antichrist. I will be proved holy through them in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God. For though I sent them into exile among the nations, I will gather them to their own land, not leaving any behind any longer. I will no longer hide my face from them. I will pour out my spirit on my people Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. When does God pour out his spirit on Israel? Again, we just read from it in Zechariah 12. When will he pour out the spirit of grace and supplication? It's when Jesus returns. When does all Israel get saved? When do we reach the point where he says, I will no longer allow my name to be blasphemed? It's not until Jesus returns. You can't take all of these events, all of Israel coming to know the Lord, all of the nations coming to know the Lord, Israel receiving the Spirit of God within them. That's not language of merely acknowledging that Jehovah is their God. That's language of salvation of the remnant of Israel, coming back to the land, forever secure, no longer the Lord leaving any of them among the nations. You cannot apply that to events that take place 7 years before the return of Jesus. It's a complete distortion of the prophecy to say that Ezekiel was speaking of something other than the return of Jesus, the defeat and destruction of the armies of the Antichrist, the salvation of all of Israel, and the remnant among the nations. It's the only way that you can make all of these things work. So what does that mean? Well, again, for clarity, what that means is that Gog is the Antichrist. This is not some preliminary invasion. What that means is that we've already discussed the fact that Russian troops on the ground in Syria, that's not the beginning of some preliminary sort of pre-Armageddon invasion by forces other than the Antichrist in the Middle East. It just simply doesn't fit. Working for Jesus in the Middle East, there are many great risks. How have you resolved in your heart to deal with potential persecution or arrests or torture, any of these things? How have you resolved in your heart to deal with these things if you should ever have to?
مثلا با شکنجه ها با ریسکش بالاست با سختی های اینجا این که مثلا دستگیر بشی یا روبرو بشی چجوری اینو هندل میکنی تو قلبت؟
جفای قسمتی از زندگی مسیح هست.
Persecution is a part of a Christian life.
و اگه بتونم یه قسمتی از زندگی مسیح رو تو زندگیم تجربه کنم این واقعا خوششانسیه برای من.
So it's my honor if I can experience part of Christian life.
یه جوری خدمت یه کار نیست، یه عشقه، بازتاب یه عشق.
Serving is my love, not my job.
و حتی خدمت کردنم یه فیضه اگه بتونم این کارو بکنم.
And serving is a grace for me if God gives this honor to you.
ولی اول خدا
But first God,
و بعد مردمی که دارن میرن جهنم
and second the people who are going to hell
ارزششو دارن.
are worthy.
مسیح گفت که من شما رو مثل بره بین گرگا میفرستم.
Jesus told to us that I will send you as a lamb between the wolves.
What I want to do now is take some time, very briefly, to look at Daniel 8, because as I've been saying, Russian involvement, Russian alliance with Iran and Syria, this is the beginning of Daniel chapter 8. So now let's go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 8. And again, I'm just barely touching this. Please get my DVD, What Comes Next. I take 1 hour to sort of carefully walk through Daniel chapter 8. But in a nutshell, Daniel chapter 8 lays out, you have the two-horned ram. He comes from the region of Persia. And then he breaks out into the whole Middle East. And it says that no one can stop him. He does as he pleases. He magnifies himself. And then you have a goat with a prominent horn, a singular prominent horn, comes from the west, from Yavan. Modern translations say Greece. Yavan is basically west coast of Turkey, as well as the region of modern-day Greece and the Balkans, some of those, that east coast of the Balkans and the west coast of Turkey. So don't think it's just the modern-day nation of Greece. That's really a misnomer. So then this goat with the prominent horn comes from the west. It's speaking of Yavon. It includes much of modern-day Turkey. And I would argue that it's probably referring to Turkey. Now, what most people have done, what most commentators, what most commentaries have done, is they've looked at this and they've said that this portion of the prophecy, that the two-horned ram and the goat, and then even, and I want you to read through this because if you're not familiar with the text, we're just skimming through it quickly. The four horns that come up after this prominent horn is broken off of the goat, people say this is speaking of the invasion of the Middle East by Medo-Persia, and then the response by Alexander the Great. Now, I believe that this is those events, that they are clear types and shadows of what will take place in the last days, because I want to look at the words of the angel Gabriel. Because this is critical. Whenever you have a difficult vision, a difficult prophecy, particularly in Daniel, but so often throughout many of the apocalyptic prophetic portions of the scriptures, then you have the interpreting angel comes along. And in this case, it's Gabriel. And what does Gabriel explain to Daniel after Daniel has just had this vision, again, of the ram and the goat and the four horns and the little horn, which is the Antichrist that comes up? What does Gabriel say? So let's begin with verse 17. Well, actually, let's go back to verse 16. It says, I heard a man's voice from the Ulai Canal calling, and he says, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. So one angel says to the other angel, he says, hey, Gabriel, go explain the vision that Daniel just had. Explain it to Daniel. What does Gabriel say? He says, he came near to me where I was standing. I was terrified, as I imagine I would be, and I fell prostrate. Gabriel says, Son of man, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. Gabriel the angel, the messenger angel, coming directly from God, he tells Daniel, he says, this vision about the goat and the ram and the goat, the four horns and the little horn, he says, Daniel, this vision concerns the time of the end. He says, Son of man, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. Okay, so Gabriel says to Daniel, he says, listen, Daniel, this vision concerning the two-horned ram and the goat with the prominent horn and then the four horns that come up after this prominent horn is broken off, he says that vision concerns the time of the end. Now I have, and I always mention this because I'm a commentary guy, I have over 150 commentaries in the book of Daniel. I am a Daniel guy. I love the book of Daniel. And I have done thorough surveys of just the broad history of how people have interpreted this particular text and any of the other key visions in Daniel. And I've only found really one guy in history that takes this sort of consistent approach, which is to say that what most people do is they look at the vision of Daniel and they say the portion about the two-horned ram and then the goat and the four horns, they say, well, that's all history. That's Alexander the Great. That's Medo-Persia. That's Alexander the Great. And again, for clarity, I believe that what happened with Alexander the Great, what happened with Medo-Persia, it was a type. It was a shadow of that which is yet to come. But the entire vision is ultimately, in its ultimate sense, intended to teach us about what will happen in the last days. Gabriel says it concerns the time of the end. If we take Gabriel's words at face value approach, if we interpret the Bible literally and just accept what Gabriel said, this is an end time prophecy. It's not a prophecy that's broken up partially between history, partially with the future. It is an end time prophecy. So then Daniel says, as he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep. Daniel passes out. He's terrified with my face to the ground. Gabriel touches me, raises me to my feet. He says, Daniel, I'm going to tell you what will happen in the latter time of wrath, the final period of indignation. Again, that language is not language of the events that took place in history with Alexander the Great. He says the final period of indignation. We know in 70 AD that Israel underwent a period of indignation. So you certainly can't say the events of Antiochus Epiphanes were the final period of indignation. This is very specific Old Testament language which speaks of the last days, the final period of indignation. He says, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And then he says, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. Verse 19. In two sentences, Gabriel, the messenger angel, directly from the throne of God, declares to Daniel 3 times that the vision concerns the time of the end. Daniel chapter 8 is an end-time prophecy. And what it lays out is that this two-horned ram, which is Medo-Persia, which is Iran, perhaps in cahoots with the Kurds, possibly, we don't know, they invade the Middle East. They invade the Middle East and they conquer the whole region. No one can stop them. They are victorious. No one can resist their will. Russian involvement, now that the fact that Russia has joined forces with Syria and Iran, I believe this is setting the groundwork for Iran's complete military invasion of the Middle East. Now, all of this year in laying out this particular chapter, and I've taught on it many times, I've said that Iran and Turkey have been fighting a proxy war throughout the region. Turkey's using ISIS, Iran is using Assad and Hezbollah, that there is already a war unfolding, it's already taken place, but there will come, this prophecy is clear, there will come a full-blown Iranian invasion of the Middle East, and Iran will be successful. What do Russian troops on the ground mean? I believe it's predicting the beginning, it's leading to the beginning of the fulfillment of a full-blown Iranian military invasion and victory over the Middle East. And it's amazing right now that as we're recording this program, as I've prepared to put this stuff together, that right now that Iranian troops are already in Syria. Iranian troops are in Syria working with Russia to defeat the various rebel factions, to defeat ISIS, to defeat these different groups that are that are fighting against Assad. That we've said this is going to happen. It was clear that it's beginning to happen. And now you have Russia that is getting behind the two-horned ram. And I'm telling you right now, America is not going to do anything about it. America is not going to resist Russia. America will roll over just like they have been for the past few years. And then we're told that after Iran eventually conquers this whole region, there will be a massive Turkish response. Now, friends, that's probably a discussion that we can have on another episode. We're basically out of time for this week. Friends, listen, the signs of the times are coming into alignment. The hour is later than most think. This is not coincidence. The ancient Hebrew prophets laid this stuff out with clarity, and it is beginning to come to place. Do we still have time? Is there still time before the return of Jesus? Yes, we are not quite there yet, but the major signs of the end times are coming into alignment. Prepare your hearts. Draw close to Jesus. Folks, I want to thank you again for being with us this week. I look forward to seeing you next week. I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.